Great, thank you. Again, like speakers before me, I just want to acknowledge all the wonderful work that was presented today, and again, thank Professor Hamilton for organizing this event today. I mean, to me, this is a wonderful collection of exactly the right people that you needed and exactly the right topics. So I'm here to talk about watersheds and give you a little bit of an insight into the work that we're doing that is very watershed-oriented. And from some of the earlier speakers, we've already heard about this not being a rural issue, not being an urban issue, but really being an Iowa issue. And I think a watershed approach is really going to be vital to us as we try to come up with solutions that are long-term, lasting, and impactful in the state. Why is this important? Well, we did a study recently. One of our staff, Antonio Arenas, led this work, and he went back and he evaluated all of the presidential disaster declarations in Iowa related to flooding from 1988 until 2016. And when you look at that work, it's interesting to see that there were 951 of these events across that time period. 951 events that had identifiably over $13 billion in infrastructure loss. So the question that we've been asking people, when you think about a presidential disaster declaration, oftentimes you think about something that's a very rare event, something that doesn't happen very often. Well, these are happening on average 30 times a year in Iowa. So is that a rare event? Or are we doing something wrong? Have we put infrastructure in harm's way? Do we not appreciate the intensification of rainfall? And so on and so forth. And so, one, we just leave you with that thought of the level of disasters that we've had. We've had a couple disaster requests again this year. I was just up at a planning and zoning meeting earlier this year where a site development in a floodplain for a commercial siting of a large box store was being discussed. And the question that I posed to planning and zoning in that discussion is, we've made a lot of mistakes 30 years ago that we regret today. Will we regret this decision 30 years from now? The evolution and the change in the 100-year flow, we're seeing the 100-year flows increase as the intensification of rainfall goes on. And in that same meeting, the representative from the box store was there, and he said, but Larry, the flood that you're referring to that happened last year, that was the perfect storm. And I just said, well, look, I caution you and everybody else in this room and everybody in this room today to not use the term perfect storm, because what had happened in Ankeny this year of 10 to 12 to 14 inches of rain, what happened just 2 weeks ago on the Saturday before Labor Day around the Marengo area of 10 plus inches of rain, we are continually seeing 10-inch rainfalls in 24 hours, and we need to be prepared for that. So how do we do that? We'd like to think that we could work at a watershed scale. This is an important project. Most of you have heard about the HUD-funded program. We had an Iowa watershed project that went on for about 5 years. We worked in the Turkey River, the Upper Cedar, Soap and Chouquest Creeks, and the Middle South Raccoon. That project was about $8.8 million. We spent $5 million on conservation practices, and at a small scale, a small watershed scale defined by the USGS as a HUC 12, if we spend about $1.5 million, we could get a very measurable benefit of stream flow reduction there. Coincidentally, as we were finishing that project, Housing and Urban Development teamed up with the Rockefeller Foundation, and they each pooled $500 million for a $1 billion program called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. The state of Iowa was awarded the fourth largest award in that competition of $96,889,000. In that program, we'll spend about $40 million on urban infrastructure in Dubuque, Coralville, and Storm Lake, and about $40 million on rural conservation on private lands for flood reduction downstream. Now, interestingly, we've had a couple nuances to the program. In our first HUD-funded project, we were able to get $5 million spent. We had a list of landowners raising their hand more than we had funding available, and so we ran out of money much quicker than we ran out of interest. This program that we're currently in, it's a 5-year project. We're approaching the end of the second year. $30 million of cost share has been made available at a 75% federal, 25% local cost share, and we're trying to work in about 25 HUC 12s. And in some of those HUC 12s, we've asked for landowner interest, and we've had no hands come up. Okay, commodity prices are different today than they were 5 years ago. We have a 75-25 cost share. We've gone back to the program. We said, okay, look, we're going to reevaluate. We're going to add a few more Huck 12s to make sure that we get the appropriate landowner interest. We also went back to housing and urban development and said we want to change in our project. We wanted a deviation, and we want to go to a 90% federal cost share, 10% landowner involvement. After a public comment period just this week, we got final approval to go to that 90-10 cost share. If we cannot sell $30 million of conservation in this state with a 90% cost share, then shame on us. That's a problem. The need is so much greater. Of that size of watershed, there are about 1,660 Huck 12s in the state of Iowa. Our estimate is we need about $3 million per Huck 12 for water quality improvement, about $3 million per Huck 12 for flood damage reduction. Multiply those numbers out, that's $4.8 billion plus $4.8 billion. That's a $10 billion program. I think it was Ray maybe that said it was a $5 billion program, 5 billion, 10 billion, pick your number. It's a big number, but if we were able to get about $200 million through Iowa or other sources into a program like this, we could do this in 50 years. We could transform the landscape of Iowa in the next 50 years. But it will take a political will to do it. It'll take citizenry getting involved, and we need a sense of urgency. And I'll talk a little more about the need for urgency here in a few minutes. So the goals of our project are to reduce flood damages, improve water quality, increase resiliency in our watershed. We do have a team working on resiliency that's really targeting a better understanding of how these natural disasters impact different sectors of our society. A lot of the workforce housing in our urban areas are built along floodplains. So these disasters are impacting people with different social status much differently than other natural disasters. We want to engage stakeholders, we want to improve the quality of life and health for all Iowans, and develop a program that's replicable across the Midwest and across the country. One of the identifying features that HUD responded to in our proposal was it was unique because we took this watershed approach. We had private-public partnership in its investment. It was a rural-urban program and something that they hope to replicate across other parts of the nation. It's really built off of the watershed management authorities. They are the local governing structure, organizing structure, and leadership in a program like this. We're delighted to work with about 25 watershed management authorities in Iowa. In this program, we're working with 8 of them. They are absolutely the leaders in their watershed, and we are just so pleased with the work that they do. We have a WMAs established in each one of those 8 watersheds. We help them with a hydrologic assessment. They've hired private contractors and other entities to develop watershed plans. We deploy monitoring equipment for hydrologic condition as well as water quality. And then we work with project coordinators who engage landowners on the adoption of practices. And it's those project coordinators, again, that get up every single day, and it's their responsibility or their job to make the watershed a better place to live. And then we use very detailed mathematical models and other methods to quantify the benefit of those conservation practices on the lands. All of the material on my presentations, the hydrologic assessment reports, which are just going out this month, are available through our Iowa Watershed Approach website, so you can get all this information there if you like. We've often talked about in Iowa precision agriculture. I'd like to think about another precision technology, and it's going to be precision conservation. We need to start putting our conservation on with much greater fidelity. Some of that will come through modeling, others through data analysis. The type of modeling that we're developing in Iowa for this project identifies at these watershed scales, very large scales, the computational element is 40 acres. So across a 40-acre parcel, we average the soils, the hydrologic condition, the groundwater, surface water interaction, the direct runoff, the land practice, the farm management practices that are going on there. And so that's a very highly resolved, very physically based model. In the Cedar River watershed, of course, we've seen maps like this for the entire state. You see, the corn, soybeans, grasslands, and other areas. We define that in a mesh, again, at a 40-acre scale, and so we really get down to the plot scale or field scale. And then we run the simulations, and this is, again, hopefully you can see it in the back. The difference between the green line and the black line is the difference between our simulated flows in Cedar Rapids for the 2008 event. It's a major significant event. It's capturing all the drainage of the entire Cedar River watershed, and to within a few percent, we're able to capture the timing and the peak of that flow in Cedar Rapids. The utility of a tool like this on the onset of a flood is absolutely incredible. The utility of a tool like this as we do conservation planning is even more important, I would argue. We can back out of this calculation because of the distribution of the computational elements. I can tell you where every gallon of that water came from. So if we wanted to think about, our CRS ratings, corn suitability ratings on land, we could also think about a hydrologic rating on the land in terms of the amount of runoff that gets produced during different events. That would change Iowa. A BMP mapping project, this is a project that we're doing in tremendous partnership with Calvin Walters and others at the Iowa DNR. This is a program that I think is nearing completion. I think there's still some final QA/QC work that's being done. But based on LiDAR data as well as aerial photogrammetry, Calvin and his team are mapping out all of the conservation that's on the land in Iowa. So this is an example of a small farm pond. You can see the red line is kind of offset from the water's boundary there. So they've identified all the farm ponds, all the terraces, all the grass waterways, all the strip crop, all the contour farming and other things. An example of what that looks like across a small Huck 12 watershed is a map that shows where all the conservation is. So precision conservation is about knowing what is already out there. It's also about running the Agricultural Conservation Planning Framework tool, which is a wonderful ag-based tool that identifies locations of conservation practice. And now we can overlay where conservation is and where we believe conservation could be adopted. And interestingly, when you look at grassed waterways, we have a very high adoption rate in most of the watersheds in Iowa. Landowners have done a pretty good job of getting grassed waterways on the land. On the other hand, if we start looking at where ponds and wetlands could go, we only have just a dozen or a couple dozen nutrient removal wetlands that have been constructed in Iowa. When we start thinking about running ACPF as a tool, now we can identify landowners that we can show have land that's suitable for a wetland. In this particular case, there were 10 small water holding structures in that Huck 12. We've identified the need for about 45. Also, if we think about a science-based approach to understanding, we have to have data. I mean, sometimes data, I think, is a challenge for us. Hydrologic data is important. We have a very sparsity of soil moisture data in our state, and it's unbelievable the dependence that we have on soil moisture and how little soil moisture data that we have. We proposed a few years ago to put a hydrologic monitoring network station, one in every county, so we proposed 99 for across the state of Iowa. Through our own funding, HUD funding, and elsewhere, we've got about 22 of those installed in Iowa now. Measuring soil temperature at 2, 4, 8, and 20 inches of depth, soil temperature, soil moisture, shallow groundwater, rainfall, and some other hydrologic conditions. Very important. Stream gauging, we've added about 250 water level sensors across the state to the 150 or so that the USGS runs as the backbone stream gauging network for the state of Iowa. And water quality, I believe we're over 70 locations, again, in partnership, about 15 from the USGS, another 55 or more from IIHR Hydroscience and Engineering, over 70 locations where we have real-time continuous water quality monitoring for the state of Iowa. That is the nation's largest water quality monitoring network. And so I do take offense sometimes when folks stand up and say we're not doing enough water quality monitoring. Certainly there's always need for more, but we do run the nation's largest water quality monitoring network. About 40% of all the real-time Nitrotex sensors in the nation are located in our state. So we're serious about this. The information has to be publicly available. This is public data on public streams that should be publicly available. The Iowa Flood Information System, we think, sets the standard for hydrologic information in the state. We are continuously bombarded with people going to this website at the time of heavy rainfall. And we've had a lot of those events here just over the last year or two. The water quality information is also put up on a water quality information system website. All of the sensors are located there. We have most of them, or as many of them as we can, co-located with USGS stream gauge sensors. So we know concentration, we know discharge. We can multiply those together to get nitrate load per minute, nitrate load per day, nitrate load per year. and then distribute that nitrate load per year by the row crop acres in that watershed to get a nitrate loss per acre per year. Very helpful data. Already today it's been mentioned, I think once or twice, a paper that was published by Chris Jones, Keith Schilling, and myself. This was analyzing Iowa DNR ambient water quality monitoring data to look at the long-term trend of nitrate load leaving the state of Iowa. It's a publication that came out this spring. Just a quick summary of the work that was done there. We evaluated 23 different locations. These are terminal or downstream locations of water quality monitoring locations. This data goes back to the late 1990s, so we have about 20 years of data. But oftentimes it's monthly data, and so stream flow is varying month by month by month. Water quality concentration or nitrate concentration varies likewise. And of course, when you multiply those two together, you get a lot of variability. And so when you try to calculate the load leaving Iowa, you can see from 1999 to 2017, you see a lot of variability. And you can easily pick out the wet years and the dry years because there's an obvious trend between high flow years and low flow years. But how do we really try to understand what happens over the longer term? Well, one approach to that is to look at the 5-year moving average. So the first year that we can calculate a 5-year moving average is 2004. And so we calculate that. And then each year, we add a year and we drop a year all the way through 2017. Well, in the paper that we published, because it was published this spring and had to go through an academic review process, we described in that paper a 47% increase in the 5-year moving average from 2004 or 3 through 2016. Well, when you add the 2017 year in, you drop off 2012, which happened to be a dry year, and the load leaving Iowa is now up over 70%. Okay, this is at a time when we're targeting a 45% reduction. So we can take it even out a little further. We can look at a 10-year moving average. Just again, to take a little more of the variability away. The first year that we can calculate a 10-year moving average is 2009. If you look at that 10-year moving average through 2017, it's monotonically increasing, albeit 1 year where there's a slight dip, but otherwise it increases each and every year. We have not reached a plateau yet, and we're showing about a 40% increase in the 10-year moving average. So if you put this into context, and this is where I get to the point of urgency, if we try to put this into context, where are we headed in the state? Well, based on this 10-year moving average, which has the least amount of variability, if we project that out to 2025, what will we have for nitrate load leaving Iowa? And why is 2025? Well, 2025 is important to us because if you remember in the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force, their recommendation was a 45% reduction by 2015. And as we approached 2015 and we blasted through 2015, not only did we not see a decrease in the load, we saw an increase in the load of nitrogen coming to the Gulf of Mexico. We saw the hypoxic zone continue to increase. And so they moved the goal out. They said, we still have a goal of a 45% reduction. The goal is now 2035, kick the can down the road 20 years. But we'll set an intermediate goal of a 20% reduction by 2025. So in 2025, if you base the future on the history, you can see the black line is roughly linear there. If we put a linear best fit line through that, in 2025, we will have doubled the 10-year moving average. Leaving Iowa, we will have doubled. So in a period when we're striving for a 45% reduction, we're going to see a 100% increase. If we don't start to have some urgency on this issue, if we don't start taking this a bit more serious, and if we don't start making some progress towards our goal. Now, it's a grand challenge. It's a grand challenge. The National Academy of Engineers did some work a few years ago. They defined 14 grand challenges for the 21st century. These were the brightest minds in engineering and science from around the world, and they came in and defined these grand challenges, and they identified things like reverse engineer the brain as a grand challenge. Better harvest energy from the sun. That's a grand challenge that faces all of humanity. 2 of those are provide access to clean drinking water and manage the nitrogen cycle. So if those are grand challenges for all of humanity, for our nation, and for this state, why can we not have an open scientific conversation about this tremendous challenge that our state faces? I think that's a challenge. So we all need to be engaged in that. I think anecdotally I shared with people, our paper came out. We were concerned about the publication of the paper and the data and the message that it might send. The paper has been out for about 6 months now, and we do really feel, and this could be very anecdotal, that I think that it's helped to empower people to stand up and to start having real conversations about this tremendous challenge that we have in Iowa. So I've left a few minutes for some questions. I'd just like to leave with this quote. It's my favorite quote. So, far and away, the best prize that life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. And I think this is worth doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so the question is, how does it shrink? So there, like our load leaving Iowa, there's a lot of variability in the dead zone. And certainly there's a lot of weather conditions and Gulf circulation that have a big impact in that. Sun and clouds and the timing of the nutrients that come to the Gulf are very important. And so, it takes the factors of sun, we've got to have a concentration, we've got to have circulation conditions in the Gulf. Those can feed in a positive way and make the dead zone even bigger. Those could feed in a negative way to break down some of those processes and result in, a year being low. This year's low, and it has surprised a lot of scientists because the loads going into the Gulf have not gone down, but the Gulf hypoxic zone is small. I would just caution us on taking too much credit, for this 1 year of a smaller hypoxic zone. It's unlikely that will persist over the next couple of years, but it's a very good question. Thank you. Well, that's another good question. Of course, it's complicated, and so we'll start with saying it's very complicated. There are many pieces that drive this. Oftentimes, when the flood center was created, we got asked a lot, what's the impact on tile drainage on flooding? And a lot of folks wanted to place blame on tile drainage for the great floods of 2008. And we did an analysis, and Iowa State University faculty were involved in this. And, as a scientist, you have not much satisfaction in coming back and saying, well, it depends. It depends on rainfall conditions and the scale of the watershed and a number of different things. And so sometimes tile drainage reduces the peak of the hydrograph of a small flood in a small basin. Sometimes it adds more water to the system and increases it. So it depends. On the other hand, with nitrogen, it no longer depends. Okay, we're able to do a principal component analysis where we can separate the nitrogen that came out of groundwater, came from surface flows, and came through tile line, and it no longer depends. Nitrogen in our streams are coming from tile. 80, 85, perhaps as high as 90% of the nitrogen in the stream is coming directly from tile lines. Now that's our biggest challenge, right? We have a very leaky system. Tile drainage is important. Managing of water is very important. On the good side of it is, once we have it in a pipe, we have our hands around it. Now what can we do with it? Do we route it through nutrient removal wetlands? Do we use bioreactors, saturated buffers? Do we store it on the surface, store it below the ground, reapply it to the landscape? 50 years from now, the management of water and nutrients will be even more important in our agricultural system than they are today. And so I think we'll see a lot of integrated irrigation drainage systems coming onto the landscape. It's tile drainage. The other thing that I just have to add is the intensification of confined animal feeding operations in northwest Iowa. The Floyd River this year has an annual average concentration of over 18 milligrams per liter. No surprise that it's also one of the locations where we have the highest concentration of confined animal feeding operations. And on average, we have county application rates of over 400 pounds an acre of nitrogen, when the Iowa State soil test maximum return on nitrogen investment is roughly 150 pounds. So we're over applying N by 250 pounds. So that's again another question. And so I'll say I can't answer that directly. We do know climate scientists that have been studying climate change, have talked about not necessarily warmer temperatures, in fact, slightly cooler Iowa summertime, peak temperatures, but increased nightly lows, so increased evening temperatures and increased relative humidity. And so we're seeing dew points come up. There are folks that are studying it, and maybe Jerry and others at USDA and ISU are studying, trying to understand transpiration that's coming off of corn crop and how that's affecting. Some folks have tried to make that case. I certainly can't answer that with any credibility. So sorry.
Larry, thank you very much.